Okay, so welcome to both of you, and thank you so much for joining the panel. So first of all, Eddy, by way of biography, is co-founded the Manchester Modernist Society in 2020 with the aim of promoting 20th century architecture in the Manchester region. The society has grown from nothing to having a very high profile with a large membership and social media following. Eddy organises public events which include walks, talks, film shows, exhibitions and art installations. Manchester Modernist also sells a wide range of products to help fund the society. In 2011, the society started a print magazine, The Modernist. This has attracted a worldwide following and regularly sells out of the print run. Eddy contributes to the writing and maintains overall control over its direction and publication. Both the society and magazine connect with members and customers entirely through social media and are constantly pushing forward both reach and profile. So welcome, Eddy. Thank you so much for joining us.
Pleasure.
And Maria Gabriella Ruban is a lecturer in filmmaking with a focus on narrative, documentary, archive interpretation and interdisciplinary collaborative projects. Maria specialises in documentary production and exhibition interpretation for cultural organisations including Manchester Art Gallery, Imperial War Museum, Pankhurst House, United Nations, Royal College of Music and the BBC. Maria was formerly artistic director at international filmmaking collective Filmonic and artist video producer at Fact in Liverpool. So thank you so much for joining the panel, Maria.
Thank you.
So we'll speak for around about 45 minutes and then that will give time for audience questions at the end if there are any questions. So first of all, Eddy, I'm going to come to you. So can you give an introduction to the Manchester Modernist Society, including your work in publishing, exhibitions, your shop and events? For example, how did the society come about? Why did you start the organisation and how has your work developed?
It came about, I was previously involved with the 20th Century Society for a long time. But I found they're a London-based organisation and they're a campaigning group. And I found them a little bit too London-centric, and I also got a little bit dismayed that it felt like a personal vendetta, that a lot of the buildings that I enjoyed were being demolished at the time. There wasn't really an appreciation, especially for post-war stuff. So I left there, and it coincided with Jack and Maureen. Maureen's now left the society, but Jack, they came from an art background. I came from more an architectural historian background, and they were looking for somebody to add weight to their art project. Really, it was always set up as an art project because they rightly considered Manchester to be a modern city with a capital M, but very much seen as a Victorian city in terms of the architecture, which it is. That does have some fine Victorian architecture, but they wanted to promote the more 20th century side of the city, because the vast majority, a significant majority of the city is 20th century. There are, a lot of Victorian buildings, but a lot of it is 20th century. So they just got me on board, and at first, there was just the three of us, and we didn't think there was anybody else who was interested in. We just started doing small events, and people started turning up to them, and it was just like, oh, we're not cranks, that there are other people interested in this. So the events got bigger, more people started attending, and then we started the magazine at a time when everybody said print was dead, but we kind of liked doing things against the grain. And then the magazine was basically based around the community that we'd already built. It was the contributors, and the magazine grew, the society grew, and with it, people would come to us with interesting projects as our reputation grew. So we would put on talks by people who were interesting, had interesting thing to say, and then mainly sort of out of the pandemic, really, when we couldn't do live events, is that we found that our printer was still printing, so we started doing small photo zines and stuff like that throughout the pandemic, and there was a lot of appetite for that. And it just grew out of there. And so, as I say, the more interesting and more meaty projects have grown into bigger books and things like that. It's just been I hate to use the word organic, but an organic growth over the last 10, 12 years. But also it's kind of coincided with a growing appreciation of post-war architecture, I think, just in general.
Thank you. Yeah, and Manchester does... Well, it's a great place to celebrate this kind of architecture. Because
yeah, I mean, ironically, it doesn't have a lot of what we can consider brutalism, compared to places like Birmingham or something like that. But I think because it has been a relatively wealthy city, and also because of the institutions that are here, mainly the university is such a big part of it. They were big practitioners of modernism. So. So you have got a very nice mix of modernist architecture in Manchester, both commercial, civic, and educational, and what have you. So it's a nice, rich mix of different architectural styles, but also sectors as well. But I wouldn't say there was one distinctive Manchester style for modernist architecture, but just quite well considering.
Thank you. Okay, so Maria. Similar sort of question to you. So you're a lecturer in filmmaking here at SODA. Can you describe your practice? What areas do you work in, and what are the current themes of your work?
So I specialise, I would say, in kind of interpreting testimony in archive, in documentary. That's where a lot of my projects are, a lot of my research is. It stemmed from doing, let's say, more sort of straightforward documentary as a freelancer. Many years ago with artists but working with that to create, primarily to do something more sort of instinctive around performance as well. So taking testimony, taking archive, creating film and turning it into something that happens just there and then. So that's quite different, and also incorporating visual storytelling into that. So that's kind of where I am at the minute with that. But primarily all stems from, I would guess, the root is documentary. So that's kind of what is interesting to me. So a lot of what we've just been watching, there's a lot to unpack there in terms of, what I think about it, what we've just seen. So, yeah.
Yeah, great. Okay, thank you.
Yeah,
so
okay.
Let's
start.
Questions.
Yeah.
So Eddy, to you first. So there's a modernist connection to the films in the screening today, and obviously your backgrounds and interests. Can you define modernism as a style of art and architecture, what it is, its history, its legacy and background?
No, not within the short time frame we've got, because it's. I think one of the architect, the contributors in the film, she said it's not a particular shape or a style. It's more of a movement. It's a feeling. But a very, very potted, quick history of modernism. It was kind of it came as more of a reaction, really, to the structures of state and religion and what have you. It was more of a reaction against that, and again, there was no ground zero, point zeros where modernism started and finished, but and it also was a little bit of a reaction to the Industrial Revolution, but at the same time it fed out of the Industrial Revolution. So it was more of a sort of non-conformity, and if there was one kind of place to form it from, is the Bauhaus, basically. And again, there was no kind of light bulb moment where it all came. It fed from different things. So you had influences from the arts and crafts movement, but you also had influence from technology and industry and stuff like that. And what the Bauhaus movement kind of did was kind of bring all these different disciplines together under one roof, quite literally. And as I said, they kind of cast off a lot of the old established ideas and ideologies, and basically had a blank piece of paper and were not held to the older ideas. So they were not afraid, to be what we probably call multidisciplinary now, and what have you. But as I say, it was kind of a reaction to what had gone before in the 19th century, and it kind of it encapsulated lots of different ideas and lots of different disciplines as well. So that's why it's so difficult to say. When people think of modernism, often they think of architecture, but it didn't. It involved writing and art and what have you, but also a way of thinking. And it was kind of, I always say it was the only ism that really was global. That we did spread around the world and still is to this day. You can, somebody talked about the international style, where I'm talking about architecture now, where you can go to any part of the world and you will see a modernist building and it'd be kind of interchangeable, which is often a criticism laid at modernism than it is, but I think that's kind of nice personally. But you go to different parts of the world and it's interpreted in different ways, which we've seen in the films. The Soviets interpreted it in a very different way than we did in the Western Europe and North America or Southeast Asia or somewhere like that. So that's a way of me sort of diverting the question, because it is too difficult to answer it. But it is an ideology more than a style of architecture or what have you, in my personal opinion. But from the modernist point of view, is we're kind of interested in it because we do sort of deep down believe that the modernists, they wanted to improve everybody's lives. They didn't succeed often, but that was the ideology, is they wanted to improve people's lives, ordinary people's lives, be it through better architecture, better design, access to art, not hierarchical art. So, we liked that kind of optimism, especially that post-war optimism that we had, where good design and good architecture could be accessed by everybody, which hadn't gone before.
Yeah, thank you. That kind of popular ideal is important. And you're right, the broadness of it through literature and architecture. But I love the fact that it was the ideas behind it were what drove the
I think it has permeated our lives. I mean, we've all got an iPhone, and I always say, the iPhone is kind of the antithesis. The not the antithesis, but the opposite. It's that is modernism encapsulated in a small. Everything's come to this point where an iPhone is the early modernists would marvel at the iPhone. This was they would look at it and say, this is what we wanted. Just minimal and technology and design all brought together in one thing, and we're living in that moment. We're living in that moment now. So modernism has perhaps come of age, I think.
The ultimate icon. On the subject of categorisation, Maria, so the films themselves, the films that we've watched today, so there's 5 short films, all by the same director, Roman Blazhan. So the films themselves defy easy categorisation. Interdisciplinary work exploring film and architecture. These are shorts, documentary with collage, music. They're not music videos, they're beyond photography. Can you define the work as a collection, or is it important not to do this? How does the visual style relate to work in other genres?
When I actually seen Enter Through the Balcony, because it was on Mubi a while back, so I was sort of familiar with that in terms of what I would say would be kind of quite typical documentary testimony collection of individual testimony in sort of exploration of people who are doing these kind of things in that way. If you see watching them in that order in particular, for me it doesn't bring it so much into you don't think about it in terms of a genre, you think about it in terms of kind of almost like an evolution, I think, of kind of where Roman is going with this idea of what is an architecture film in that sense, because effectively they're exploring architecture, they're exploring movements, they're exploring society within that, the change within that. And so they've gone from literally looking at buildings and then looking at, particularly with the first one, looking at kind of the kind of more religious ones within all this kind of modernist stuff. And then when you get to Enter Through the Balcony, sort of seeing it in that way, you then start to get the people as the character, as opposed to the buildings being the character. And the idea of this sort of huge, sort of state-controlled buildings, all these things that have been there for years in terms of kind of the Soviet structure, and then we actually get to the point where the people are there. And that to me is really important. because we've gone from a huge kind of video essay, if you like, to actually testimony. And that's a big development because that really kind of shifts the genre. So it is genre defining defying in that way. It's interesting because the kind of the architecture film in itself isn't really necessarily something that I would say is a genre. I would say more usual, particularly in this country, the way that you would explore buildings would be probably through a more poetic or lyrical form. I'm thinking of people like Andrew Cotting and things like that, or Cottingley, sorry, who would go through kind of landscapes in that way, usually kind of in the kind of almost William Blake style. And things like Lynn Ramsey when she did The Swimmer and things like that, and we're going through, we're hearing more kind of audio and a kind of sense of the past as opposed to just looking at buildings. So it is kind of quite different in that way to how we would normally explore a landscape or buildings in that way. So it is kind of quite unusual, but to see that kind of development from just looking at the buildings to actually how people are living in them and how people are changing them and being individuals within it. That's why it kind of is difficult to say that it's specifically any kind of genre in that way. The first couple, though, are very much about, it almost feels like we're kind of, we're not as encased with concrete to a certain extent, and it can feel a little bit kind of overwhelming with all these buildings all the time, particularly because they're such huge structures on a scale that we're kind of not used to. So you kind of feel a bit overwhelmed, and maybe that's the whole point of them, that we're kind of meant to feel overwhelmed and lost within it and part of the state, and then we get to the individual, so it feels a bit safer in that way. So I don't know if that has quite answered your question, but it's definitely an evolution of kind of sense that at a point the director actually thinks, I need to speak to some people, which is really important.
Yeah, I did sense a theme running through them, and it's something that we try and instill as well in the Modernist. It's about a sense of place. It's less about concrete and the glass, and it's about a sense of place. And I think in all the 5 films, the director was trying to invoke a sense of place, in different ways. And I think that's a much more interesting story for us as well. Human stories and why things are the way they are, not the facts about it. The facts are there. Some people are interested in facts, but I think the human stories are a lot more interesting. And we kind of like to shine a light in places that aren't the big hitters. The star places. Everybody knows the Barbican. That's great. Everybody knows Park Hill, but we like to go to Rotherham and see a police station. Which are much more interesting, or go and see a toilet block in Blackburn. I'm not joking. I think those stories are a lot more interesting, and some of these films were exploring that, and things that I didn't know about, which are great. Which is great for me, for a know-it-all like me, to find things out from films like this.
What did you think of the one on the beach then, in particular? In that sense, that was getting a little bit more into that sort of, these people were very much inhabiting this space. Exactly. It was much more about them.
And that is the other theme as well, about people inhabiting spaces, isn't it? And doing it on their own terms.
Yeah, they were very much on their own terms.
On their own terms. It's just like, I don't think that was a formal beach. I think that was that. I don't know the geography, but I think that's just the side of a lake, is it? Or
it's river? On the River Dnipro. Yeah. So it's on the side of the river in central Kyiv.
So people will, and the other thing is, the other recurring theme is people will always find a way. They will always find a way. I want to go to a beach. I haven't got a beach, but there's a side of a river. I'm going to go to the beach. I haven't got a balcony, but I'm going to build one. So that's kind of the recurring theme that I kind of, the resilience of people.
I want to touch upon this idea of the past. So this question's to you, Eddy, but obviously Maria, jump in. So one of the themes of the work is the evidence and traces of the past and how to deal with this in architecture. So you described it when we spoke as a parallel to the Stalinist idea of erasing everything to create a new future. Can you elaborate on this? Where do you stand on the need to rebuild, to restore the legacy of history and the value of past?
I have to caveat this with saying it's very easy for me to sit here in the comfort of this room, having not lived under communism, having not lived in Ukraine or even under any totalitarian government. And it's very easy to fetishize these things. So I will caveat with that. But at the same time, there are examples, where we have had trouble with our pasts, and sometimes, architecture is a point in time, and I think the Germans do it quite well. Is they reflect on their history, but they don't try to erase the architecture that reflected that period in history. And I totally understand why former Soviet states do want to erase that part of their history, which they have a problem with. But I do fear it is slightly Stalinist, fascistic to cherry pick from history which bits you don't do and don't like. I think you need to have grown-up conversations, and you have to look at it from lots of different angles. From an architectural as well as a political or ideological angle. I'm glad to see some buildings torn down for ideological reasons, but maybe I'm not the best person. I would rather there was some measure. And as I said, I repeat this. I kind of understand why former Soviet states would want to remove these buildings, but at the same time, we have an expression: throwing the baby out with the bathwater. You have to be careful what you are erasing, because we're informed by our past as well, aren't we?
My next question sort of builds really on some of these ideas. So you are, like I am, of Ukrainian heritage. What is your position on building and rebuilding after the war, both in architecture and in all forms of art? What and where is the value of creativity in nation building in Ukraine?
Wow, what a question. I mean, it's difficult because obviously we're in a position now. I mean, if you'd asked this question maybe 3 years ago, maybe not even 3 years ago, because 2014. I mean, to me in particular, let's start with the 2014. I think that's when a lot of this idea of what is Ukrainian culture and how do we preserve it, how do we maintain it, how do we bring it into the kind of wider world, really kind of kicked off for me in particular. From 2014, and I think it's difficult. Just wanted to pick up on what you said as well. There's an issue in terms of, again, fetishizing kind of Stalinist ideas. A lot of this architecture in particular, a lot of kind of ideas about communism, communist art, even, and what they mean, communist literature. And not understanding how it is to actually live under those regimes, or to have existed under them, or had to have family under them, and what that actually means on a day-to-day basis for people who are there. And for people who are living under it, for them as well, it's difficult for them to understand having had that taken away from them, and to exist sort of trying to retain something, but at the same time trying to move forward. You've got complete kind of dislocation of different ideals. So what we think is kind of Ukrainian culture and what our understanding of it comes from a different position to people who are, have been there for a long, had to live under this. And I think there has to be some kind of understanding and conversations around, actually the conversation is the word that what you've said, exactly that, these conversations. So things like this today is really important. Seeing films, seeing what people are doing, what artists are doing in Ukraine, from Ukraine, how they're interpreting, and having conversations with them about it, as opposed to kind of having our ideas as well. It needs to be a shared conversation, definitely. And I've come to this position quite sort of piecemeal in a way, because I come from kind of a split family, so one's Italian, one's Ukrainian, and there are certain ideas of what that means and what that entails on a day-to-day basis, and none of that is true and none of that is real, and the actual reality of living in Italy is completely different to the romanticization of it. So you have to kind of have conversations and understand with it. From my understanding of what's from watching films like this and seeing what's going on, there's a huge amount of culture, lots of young artists who are doing amazing stuff in especially kind of digital art in Ukraine, and having conversations with them about how to make sure that that is continuing. That to me is really important. Not kind of sort of being, romanticising it or anything like that. It's about them being able to have that access and being able to show in a way that is just normal and usual. If there was that to me is the threat at the moment is if something happens and that stopped, but then we're back to how it was in the beginning, of the kind of when it was closed off, 30s, 40s, however you want to do it. So being able to have that open discussion is really, really super important, and to have that, that's to me is the most important thing at this point in time.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
So just to pick up on the context, I'm sure most people will be aware that the war in Russia started with Russia's annexation of Crimea and the Donbass. That was in 2014.
Yeah.
So 2022 is a full-scale version of a war that already exists. Okay, so Eddy, to bring the conversation back to Manchester and some of your comments from the beginning, so what connections do you see in the films with modernism in Ukrainian architecture and modernism in Manchester, and what is the legacy of this period in Manchester?
It's kind of been erased. Is as probably the only real parallel is large scale public housing, which we don't do anymore, and the fall of communism kind of was sort of coincided with the free market economy of the 1980s in Britain, really, and the demise of large-scale public housing, and the undermining of civic values, really. The third film, the two people who'd written the book, kind of annoyed me a little bit, to be honest with you. I think they were wrong. She was talking about there's a disconnection between the
generational gap.
The generation gap. She's not here to defend herself, but that's nonsense. That doesn't happen it might happen in the Ukraine, but it doesn't happen in the UK. And what she got wrong there was she was sort of blaming architects for that disconnection. It's not that. It's who are commissioning these buildings and what these buildings are for. So in the post-war era, in Soviet countries, there was a huge demand for better housing and the building of civic buildings and what have you, and that came from the state. So these buildings were built for a very specific purpose. So they went to an architect the client was the state. So the architect was only following what the client was asking. And now that's gone. The state is no more, or the big state is no more. Now it's commercial interests. So they've got different needs. So that's where the disconnection is. It's not the architects. Stop blaming the architects for not talking to each other. That's not true. I know lots of architects who've got a huge respect for the generations that have gone before them. And I think what happened in the UK and Manchester is, again, the priorities changed. So in the immediate post-war period, again, with the same concerns for better housing, and there was more large-scale civic projects, bigger schools, better hospitals, growth of education, higher education, and what have you. So they were the big clients. So the architects were doing those kind of schemes. And it's a very long way of me saying is that we had things like the Crescents in Hume, which were often labelled Soviet type architecture, but it was just large scale. In fact, ironically, lots of Soviet town planners and architects actually travelled to the UK to see what we were doing in the UK. Park Hill, for example, in Sheffield, was held up as an exemplar, and they went back and copied what we were doing with large scale housing. But then, as I said, as the demise of large public housing schemes and large scale civic projects kind of went by the wayside in the 80s and the 90s, and we've just got a more commercial edge now, which you can see, which I think they were deckled in the second film, where it's saying, just commercialisation has taken over lots of spaces and buildings and what have you. And we kind of see that rampant free market economy in Manchester now. And I think it's just kind of reflected in former Soviet as well, and how capitalism is king, and it's kind of it's unregulated and it's rampant and there's no order to it and what have you, on a macro and a micro scale as well. So I don't think there's that many parallels, but I think the parallel to draw is the demise of the big state and what their needs were, or what they thought their needs were.
Because it almost happened overnight. So it happened, the state disappeared.
Yeah.
So then you suddenly get people who are just, right, well, I'll just
and
improvise.
It's like a logjam, isn't it?
Yeah.
And it's and lots of years of frustration have built up, and they want to do it, and it is unrestrained. I suppose, it's a bit like Manchester in the 19th century, when it was a shock city and it grew rapidly, and again it was unrestrained capitalism. There was no order, and it was panic, and you kind of get a feeling that's that chaos, which I kind of love about it. There is that chaos there, but as a pure modernist, it's just like, oh no, stop it. I like the order of modernism, and dare I say it, I kind of like this sort of personally, like a bit of authority, and this needs to be done this way, but that's just me.
No, but what happens is you get people who are working in places like the car factory or wherever they're working, and then they'll just create that. So even here, we never had anyone mend anything in our house. It was always other Ukrainian people would bits from whichever car factory in Coventry they worked in, or whatever it is, and we'd end up with all like these weird things. So it's kind of it is that kind of make do and mend, but on an ostentatious scale, if you like.
I also think as well,
no authority, no state control.
That we have too much stuff now. We don't. When those houses, when this accommodation was built in the communist, probably the reason they were so small and there was no storage is because nobody had stuff. It's like when you look at social housing that was built in the 1930s. The houses were very, very tiny with no storage, but they had massive gardens, huge gardens, because that was important. Because people didn't have stuff. We've just got too much stuff now because we're capitalists. So that's my house is full of junk, and I really could do with getting rid of it. And I totally empathise with all these people putting it on. But I suspect when a lot of those flats were built, just people didn't have a lot of stuff, and that's why. But since capitalism has taken over consumerism, you just consume more stuff, and that's that was a bit of a tangent. Sorry, but yeah.
It leads me actually very nicely onto the next question, which is about sort of the individualisation and the final film in particular. So this question's for you, Maria. The last film, Enter Through the Balcony, shows people's relationships to their homes, the buildings they live in. The interviews bring life to the architecture. Where and how do you see this is important in the construction of film narrative? How do the characters of the people bring out the character of the buildings?
So there's a couple of interesting techniques that are used in that film. So you've got people who are living there, who are talking about how they've done the work on the balcony, and then you've also got other sort of, let's say, more architecturally informed or anthropologically informed, who are kind of putting the context within it as well. So it feels, that's why it feels like that one's much more, it feels like almost a more standard documentary, in that you've got a question, what is going on with these balconies, and you have to answer it. So you have kind of different people feeding in to answer your question. So in terms of kind of the construction of it, it feels like it's one of those puzzles that they've had to solve and kind of work out how to put it together in that way. Very, very kind of classic documentary, working out all the kind of transcriptions and putting it together. And then you have the kind of the kind of ups and downs of where it is in terms of, this is the kind of information that we need to understand the context of how these people are living, understand how it's different to other places. And then, a couple of beautiful cats in there as well, which are always great to see. Really love Ukrainian cats. So it feels like a kind of very not standard, because it's not. I don't want to kind of use that word, but it does feel like it's kind of very neatly put together in that way, informed opinions, and then also the testimony, and we feel like we've kind of delved into this world in that. So it does feel that, yeah.
It seems to be much balance, though. There wasn't a voice who was saying this is wrong and we shouldn't stop doing it. We should stop doing this. And I would have liked to have heard at least one voice saying, because a lot of them did look very, very dangerous.
They did look very, I think, but also they're kind of quite comfortable with that being on the edge, edge of it all.
Because even the officials seemed quite cool with it. The head architects of the cities, which I presume were employed by the state. They all seem quite cool with it.
I mean, some of them did look like I don't understand how they were able to kind of function.
No, it was making my teeth on edge. Looking
yeah,
at some of them, not from an aesthetic, but also from an engineering point of view.
But then we don't. Yeah, we're not told of the accidents. I mean, there's probably another side to it, but I imagine that there's a lot of hit and misses there. But again, we're falling into that trap of being slightly romanticising about it all and romanticising about the thing. But I mean, I think it was genuinely a kind of a heartfelt exploration of this this thing that kind of sort of was always there, and then it kind of blossomed once kind of more individually. I guess the other thing that kind of struck me as well is that we're watching these and we're not sure whether some of these places are still there. Mm. So it's so the first time I think I saw a bit of this was on Mubi, and then obviously saw it again. So we're watching these and talking about a lot of this, and thinking about, well, actually, what are the stories now that are going to be told about these people living in these buildings, and those questions that the people were asking in the one about sort of the totalitarian state and what the buildings there, like what is the next cycle in terms of what is happening here. So with looking at this, particularly through the balcony one and how that's kind of constructed, it does make me think that this is, I'm thinking about the next steps in terms of how we tell these people's stories.
Yeah, thank you. That's a really important point.
Yeah.
Because now in 2024, since 2022, this film as a portrait takes on a completely new significance.
Different. Yeah. All of these films do. And all of the, we still hear about this sort of trying to keep things normal in places. People, the kind of cafe culture that's still kind of persisting, even though there's bombs and all kinds of just awful things, and people still trying to keep things normal. But we don't know whether, what is the next step for these buildings. Is there going to be a different kind of aesthetic? What's going to replace them? In terms of kind of Ukrainian identity post this Russian invasion. But yeah, we don't know what's happened to these people. So it becomes. It makes it feel different about the kind of these individuals and what's going on.
Yeah, and of course there are buildings that have been targeted because of their significance.
Yeah.
Okay, I think I'll ask one more question for Eddy, and then I'll open it up to questions from the floor if there are any. So, you recently hosted an exhibition of Ukrainian modernist architecture at the Modernist Gallery. And there's a publication available to document the project, and you've also brought copies of that. Can you talk about the work and the project and how it came about?
It was 4 female Ukrainian artists. One was based in London, one was based in Switzerland, and 2 were still based in the Ukraine. One was flitting between the UK and Ukraine, and they were already, before the conflict, were already interested in, again, I'm not going to embarrass myself by trying to say the names, different forms of social housing in the Ukraine. I think there was 4 particular prefabricated modular types, and they were kind of very affectionate towards them even before the conflict, and their work was informed by them. And they did it in very different ways. One was a graphic designer, one was a ceramicist, and so another was worked in audiovisual. So they were a collective, and then the conflict happened, and we were contacted by a guy called Owen Hatherley, who's a writer who does lots of architecture, but he's also does a lot of work about the Soviet Union and what have you. He's very prolific. He's a friend of ours, and he said, "Have you heard about these people?" And we hadn't, and they were. They had the show was on in Goldsmiths in London. So we just reached out to them and said, if you're looking for a place to show it, then we'd love to have it, because the start of the conflict was still very raw, and we were very upset about it at the Modernist. We don't just look at buildings; we are human beings as well, and it was just their annoying optimism, and which was it was just like, these people are going through terrible things. Their families are in war zones, but they were so positive, and they had such a great attitude to everything. So we hosted it, and it was lovely, and we not only showed the work, but we did a very nice event over at the university where they talked about the work as well, which was really well attended. And we just it was the work itself was intriguing, and we as it was, but at the time it was we thought it was something really worth doing, and that they were very, very appreciative. We were really glad about that. I'm not saying that bragging. It was just very, very nice that we were able to help them at a time when in our tiny little gallery, and to do a publication as well, to get out there to the world, was just important for us, because as I said earlier, there is sometimes you fall into the trap of fetishizing these things from a distance, and it's just like, oh, very well, this Soviet architecture is all very great and looks great, and there was a vogue for these books about Soviet war memorials as well at the time, which I started to feel a little bit uncomfortable with, because again, we try to be objective, but we always caveat it. We'd say, we have this white privilege, we have this Western privilege, I have a male privilege, and we have to think about these people and what they're going through. And what I kind of learned is that this particular style of architecture sort of perversely was the most vulnerable and was causing the most casualties, because it was high density housing and it was very tall. And at the beginning of the conflict, when it was missile attacks, the missiles weren't particularly clever. Clever, terrible word to use, but they were coming into the cities, and the first building they were hitting were these tall buildings which were densely inhabited. So they were taking the brunt of the missile attacks, and it added a whole new level of meaning to their work from pre-conflict, when they were celebrating this work, to kind of, I don't know how to say it, memorialising it in a very sad way. So it took on a whole new meaning once the conflict started. But, from a very base artistic level, it was great work as well.
Yeah, thank you both so much for the discussion, for the insights that you both brought. Just completely different perspectives on the films that we've watched. Both of you are really equally expert in things that are very related to the set of films, but just completely different in your positions and the work that you've been doing. So thank you so much. So there's another screening tomorrow, same time, which is a Ukrainian classic called Shadows of Forgotten Ancestors. And along with that, there's a short film by an artist, Alia Dematerko, called On Volia, Filling in the Frescoes. And then next Monday, there's an American film called The Babushkas of Chernobyl. And after that, there'll be a Q&A with a scientist, Richard Taylor from the University of Manchester, who specialises in nuclear energy. So you're very welcome to join for either or both of those events. And thank you again to the two panellists.
Thank you.
Thanks
Thank
for
you.
coming on.
Thank
You're
you.
very welcome.
Thank you.